we're talking about varieties of experience, there were also continuities, things that every single enslaved person experienced. Every single enslaved person was coerced in one way or another. They were forced into a situation that they did not choose. Every single enslaved person experienced instability, that they or their loved ones could be sold or their situation could change at a moment's notice, which they had no control over. And every enslaved person also resisted the dehumanization of slavery, and often they resisted the fact of slavery itself. So coercion, there are several methods and levels of coercion that went into slavery in the 19th century. The most obvious, the one that students are most likely to be exposed to, is the physical and economic coercion of slavery. Some of this is direct physical abuse, that an individual forces another individual to do something with the threat of violence, with being beaten, with being burned, with having forced amputations, with having all sorts of unimaginable torture or any torture that can be imagined imposed on a person in order to force them into various kinds of behavior, whether it's labor or sexual behavior or an attitude. Anything can become a rationale for physical abuse. There's the physical and economic pressure of inadequate resources. Humans need food and clothing and shelter. Enslavers controlled food and clothing and shelter. Giving those resources or withholding those resources was a method of coercion. A person who worked was a person who was fed, had decent housing, and if an enslaver wanted to punish or torture an enslaved person, they could do it through withholding food, withholding clothes, withholding decent housing. There's also an element of coercion, and there's also an element of coercion through labor itself. A person who has just worked 14 hours in a cotton field isn't likely to stay up and plan rebellion in the middle of the night. By forcing individuals to work, by not giving them quite enough food, quite enough clothing, keeping them in a constant state of discomfort and exhaustion, helped to prevent uprisings among the enslaved population, because they were tired enough that it was simply easier to do as they were told rather than to formulate the energy needed to resist. There's also a strong system of social coercion that begins with dehumanization. The broader white society persistently and consistently argued African Americans were not human, that they did not have the same sensitivity to pain that white humans did, that they did not make the same kinds of emotional bonds that free people did, that they didn't have the same needs for physical comfort that free humans did. This insistence on African Americans as a different kind of person was dehumanization, and it was this insistence that is still insidious in our society today, that somehow African Americans are intrinsically different than white Americans or other races. It's wrong, and it was part of making slavery okay for the broader American society. While they are insisting on the lack of humanity for enslaved people, enslavers were also playing on the humanity of enslaved people by coercing them into behavior through the threats of family separation. They controlled behavior by threatening the family members of enslaved people, that if a man would not accept torture or punishment on his own behalf, perhaps if they threatened his wife or his daughters with punishment and torture and rape, then he would perform the behaviors that they were asking for. So this connections that enslaved people formed among each other became a way that enslavers could coerce behavior from enslaved people. There was also a system of legal prohibitions on enslaved people to further control their behavior. It was illegal in most places for enslaved people to be off the place where they were enslaved, to be out of the direct physical control of their enslavers. And a person who is off the plantation they are supposed to be on can be captured and beaten and returned to their enslavers. They were also prohibited from gaining education, and this prohibition grew in the 19th century. By controlling education, they were controlling communication. It made it that much harder for enslaved people to learn what was happening off of their own plantations, to learn about what was going on in the wider community. It made it more likely that enslaved people would accept their position instead of resisting it. Every enslaved person was legally property. And that meant that they had no control over their own lives or over the lives of their loved ones, that they had no predictability over their lives. And it was very common for an enslaver to act very kind toward their enslaved people, to treat them well, to say, oh, you're a member of the family, and then to lose those enslaved people in a card game, for a plantation owner to die of a heart attack and all of his enslaved people were given out to relatives as an inheritance and people were separated from their families. There was simply no predictability from one day to the next that an enslaved person's situation was going to stay the same. And so that constancy of not knowing, of never being quite sure what was going to follow the next day was a constant and underlying stress for every enslaved person. Every enslaved person found a way to resist the dehumanizing effect and pressures of slavery. Sometimes it was purely an internal resistance that they could tell themselves they were human. In other cases, it is much more overt. One of the most widespread methods of resistance was economic resistance, which would often take the form of labor defiance, which means that the enslaved people would be assigned to a task. They would do that task slowly, they would do it incorrectly, they would do it in a way that cost money. Enslaved people were very well aware that their enslavers were getting money off the labor of enslaved people, and they adjusted their labor to not be as profitable, to not produce as much cotton. And there's always a line that they're walking because they don't want to get punishment for themselves, but they also don't particularly care about the profits that their enslavers are getting. This gave rise to complaints and stereotypes about enslaved people as being slow, as being lazy, as being stupid, largely those actions were taken as a form of resistance, not because the individuals were actually slow or lazy or stupid. They could also simply have an attitude that was resistant, to be sullen, to be smart-mouthed, to be anything other than docile and compliant was a form of resistance, was a form of asserting their own humanity in the face of enslavement. There's also direct resistance against property. Story after story after story of enslaved people finding a dead pig. Oh, we just found him there. No, they didn't. They took the pig and they killed it and they ate it. Theft, destruction of property in ways that could help the enslaved people survive and also happened to inflict some kind of pain on their enslavers. Enslaved people also resist enslavement through social connections, and these are the same social connections that were also used to coerce them in slavery. But having a spouse, having children, having siblings, simply having friends was incredibly important to survival. And making those connections, loving other humans, was a way of resisting dehumanization, was a way of asserting their own humanity. Religion, particularly Christianity, became more and more important to the enslaved community in the 19th century. The Second Great Awakening brought much more preaching into the South and an increased desire from the enslavers to introduce Christianity to their enslaved people. And the enslaved people took up Christianity in very particular ways. They took up the story of Jesus and salvation as a way out of the misery of their lives, out of the misery of slavery. And they also resonated with the story of Moses and the Jews escaping from slavery for obvious reasons. And those became very strong themes in the African American community of salvation in a better world and of escape. Enslaved people also resisted slavery with education. Even though there were laws against teaching African Americans to read, white children who played with enslaved children very frequently taught them to read. It might be as little as teaching them an alphabet, but human brains are really good at this. So an enslaved child who has been taught the alphabet can teach themselves to read from there, and many of them did. Once they have education, written communication is a way of learning what's happening in the wider world. It's a way of communicating back and forth between separated families. It's a way of broadening a person's mind beyond what they've been condemned to on the plantation. And so education is a really important way of gaining a strong sense of self and your place in the world as an enslaved person. And of course, there was direct resistance to enslavement through physical means. The stories that kids learn in school are often about direct physical confrontation, about Frederick Douglass standing up to his overseer and refusing to take a beating, of Nat Turner fomenting a rebellion and murdering white men. We hear about these direct, dramatic resistances. We hear about escape. Again, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Henry Bibb, Harriet Jacobs, all of these people escaped slavery and are lauded for it. We tend to hear the stories about people who escaped to freedom, who got to the North. A much more common experience was a kind of a temporary escape, where a person escaped the plantation where they were enslaved and went into the woods or into the swamps for a few days or a few weeks and then returned. Sometimes they would simply walk back into the fields and go back to work again. For whatever reason, they were not escaping all the way to the north, but they were kind of taking a break. They were getting away from an intolerable situation for a short time and then returning. That was far more common than deciding you were going to go all the way to get to freedom.